In a previous video, I looked at whether I could use AI art to generate a cover for one of my books, and that generated a comment which I thought was particularly interesting. It's this one on the screen, which you can see from the relaxing ride. And what they've done here is they've used AI to generate their comment. But I was particularly interested in what they asked the AI to do and what it came up with, because they gave the prompt, "Can you give me a few hundred words on the ethics of using the likeness of people both living and dead, as well as artist styles in the prompting of AI-generated art? Please write in the style of HP Lovecraft." And this is what it came up with.
The ethics of using AI-generated art in the likeness of people and artist styles is a question that has long vexed me, a concern that has plagued my mind like the incessant scratching at the door of some eldritch abomination. To use the likeness of a living person without their knowledge or consent, to exploit their image for our own gain, is a transgression of the most heinous nature. It is a violation of their autonomy, a disdain for their privacy. To use the likeness of the deceased, without the permission of their surviving kin or estate, is to desecrate the very memory of their being, to reduce them to a mere tool for our own exploitation. But it is not only the individuals represented who are affected by this unethical use of AI-generated art. There is also the matter of misrepresentation, of art being mistaken for the work of the original person or artist, leading to confusion and potentially causing harm to their reputation or financial standing. And then there is the question of the impact on the broader art community. Some argue that the use of AI to generate art in the likeness of people or in the style of existing artists is a threat to the value of human creativity, a blow to the very role of the artist in society. In conclusion, the ethics of using AI-generated art in the likeness of people and artist styles is a complex and multifaceted issue, one that requires careful consideration of the potential impacts on the individuals represented, as well as the broader art community. Let us use good judgment and act with the utmost ethical integrity in these matters.
It doesn't read like something written by HP Lovecraft. It doesn't seem to have replicated his style at all to me. It seems like somebody's created more like an academic paper and then just copied in sort of little bits here and there, like the Eldritch Abomination reference. It's just a piece, it seems like a piece of non-fiction with that tacked on. But to truly judge that, we need to know how HP Lovecraft actually writes, what defines his style. The disadvantage for myself over the AI is that the AI should, in theory, be able to get access to his entire back catalogue, analyze it very rapidly and see what the sort of tropes are. It might even have access to things that were written about his style. Whereas I have this. The Call of Cthulhu is in that book. Shadow over Innsmouth is in that book. The Colour Out of Space is in that book. So that's the book that I tend to read when I'm just wanting to read a bit of HP Lovecraft. But I've never really thought about what it is that is the defining characteristics of his work and whether this AI has captured that. So I have skim read the 3 stories that I mentioned and picked out 1 or 2 passages that I think are representative of Lovecraft's style. There's 3 or 4 things that I think are repeated in terms of style. Outside influences, things that pressure or alter or control somebody's ability to think or act. So we have that here. This passage is from Shadow over Innsmouth, like the curiosity of people is lapsing, and what that has caused is this odd craving, an unexplained behaviour, or a behaviour that is not typical. We have here as well this word mute, in that while he stayed mute, you would expect probably a more idiomatic use of the word there, just to be more simply quiet. I've stayed quiet or silent, but mute, of course, has connotations of mutism, and that is involuntary. So again, influence of outside forces on one particular person. And we see that if we look at some of these other passages that I picked out. There's a disturbing suggestion made me conclude. In The Colour Out of Space, I felt an odd reluctance. Again, we are seeing a word repeated there, odd. It's not like evil or imposing, it's unusual, it's creepy. I hinted. It's an example of a sort of much more weaker power. And there's the last example of it, which is from the Call of Cthulhu, which is something very like fright, so not fright, but again, it's come over these explorers before anything more definite. So they haven't seen anything other than rock and ooze and weed, but they've already got this uncanny reaction, this something's not right here feeling. And that is, I think most people would agree, pervasive through the whole work of HP Lovecraft. The next thing, or you may have already noticed as well, there's the sheer number of adjectives. You know, you'll hear, particularly, I've just read Douglas Adams, and he says like this, the sign of an amateur writer is the number of adjectives, or an excess of, but we certainly see a lot of adjectives. It's not just a seaport, it's a seaport of death and blasphemous abnormality. Giving all of this is giving us information about this seaport. So there's 5 rather, about just one noun. Very unusual. But even here, like old story, public interest. That's an adverb, odd craving. To whisper, those few frightful hours. The ancient spires. We don't get anything with roofs, but we get a decaying Innsmouth. Ancient spires and decaying Innsmouth, which gleamed lovely and ethereal in the magic yellow moonlight. They're not just days, they're old days. Here we have gentler slopes, the farms are ancient and rocky, there's squat moss-coated cottage, there's even the New England secrets are old New England secrets, and the ledge is not just a ledge, it's a great ledge. So you definitely see a lot of adjectives. Douglas Adams would not approve. And the last thing that I'm noticing as I look through is a lot of relative clauses, sometimes appositives, built-in phrases that give more information about a noun. So occasionally we see these subordinate clauses embedded in the middle of a sentence or point. And the last thing that seems to be a recurring theme is doubling, occasionally tripling. Something is something and something. We've got it in the first line here. The affair was fresh and uncertain. Public interest and curiosity are gone. It's not just ill-rumoured or evilly shadowed. It's ill-rumoured and evilly shadowed. It's a seaport of death and blasphemous abnormality. Farms aren't just ancient or rocky, they're ancient and rocky. The diminutive figure isn't just strange or having a genuinely abysmal antiquity. He has both. And vistas aren't just unopened or archaic. They're both. The data is received with suspense and astonishment. Interestingly enough, it's doubly exciting. And in the last example, rock and ooze and weed. So it's not just a doubling there, it's a tripling, which is probably in keeping with the monstrosity of Cthulhu. It gets that extra one on the end. So then we need to look at the vocabulary of HP Lovecraft. So what I have here is a piece of software. It's called AntConc, and you can use it to analyze the word usage, collocations and things like that in a text. And I have already imported the one HP Lovecraft book I have as a text file, which is The Call of Cthulhu. Now, the AI here has a distinct advantage over me in that it will very quickly have access to all of the works of HP Lovecraft, whereas we just have this one, or I would need to find a corpus that had all of them in there. It probably is already existing on the internet. I just don't have it. And if we look at the word list, we will get like word classes, closed word classes are typically at the top, determiners and prepositions and things like that. Some very common verbs like was. So the first word that we have that's not from a closed word class is cult. It's a noun. We can invent nouns all the time. The next one is professor. I think, where was cult? There's cult, there's professor. Old is quite high, so we would expect to see in an HP Lovecraft text, if this is indicative of the whole of his work, we would expect to see cult, professor, old, and then we see dreams. probably quite high. What you'll find if you have, and Conk is free, but there's other software that you can pay for, then what that will do is it will tell you, you can import like another corpus of general text or general stories, and it will tell you whether dreams is more frequent in HP Lovecraft's corpus than in the other one. So you can have a comparison between what HP Lovecraft writes and generally what is used in English, which obviously is a lot more useful than just having this. It's a story about, I mean, we see from Johansson being there, it's a story about certain things, and those things we will expect to see appearing more often. Is that indicative of an entire body of work? Possibly not, although I think most people would expect dreams to feature quite highly in HP Lovecraft's work generally. Wilcox, Cthulhu, Legrasse, we're seeing the names of the characters here. Strange, we would expect strange, wouldn't we? Actually, we're quite a long way down now before we're starting to see some of the words that I thought might be a little higher, but they're still probably, I think, more common here than you'd find them anywhere else. Things like ancient at the top there, and down at the bottom we have terrible. See, there's a word that I thought might appear more often than it does, would be abnormal. It seems from having read The Shadow over Innsmouth that abnormal was used a lot in that book. And another word that I really noticed appearing a lot in The Shadow over Innsmouth was furtive. Almost every other page, but not in the Call of Cthulhu at all, which shows you the weakness of having such a small corpus as opposed to the complete works. But I think we have something to go with. We're seeing words that are strange, dreams, ancient, and horrible. We're seeing those words being very common in the Call of Cthulhu, and I think that they probably would be words that were common across his entire work. So the 5 things that we're going to be looking at in the AI's work is: 1, is there discussion of or hints of an external compulsion? Is there a larger number of adjectives than we might expect? Is there lots of ands and doubling, or perhaps even some tripling? Are there embedded clause or relative clauses or appositives? And then we're going to be looking at the vocabulary. Particularly, we're going to be looking for words old, strange, dreams, ancient, and terrible. So let's have a look. Now that's interesting. There's not a single example of old, nor of strange, nothing of dream or dreams, nothing of ancient, and nothing of terrible. So of the vocabulary we found, the AI has used no examples of that at all. The closest we do have is this Eldritch abomination. I did expect to see more abomination in the Call of Cthulhu than we did. So let's have a look back at the Call of Cthulhu and see whether Eldritch is in there at all. Yeah, once. And what about abomination? I'm going to put abomin star because then it'll find abominable as well. 1, abominable, nothing for abomination. That's interesting, isn't it? I thought that that would be higher in the Call of Cthulhu. But it isn't. But it is the words that the AI has picked up as being significant for his style. I don't think it's gone for his style in terms of vocabulary at all. It's just gone for more themes. But let's have a look at the genuine style in which it's written. And we're going to be looking for external compulsion. Okay, so what I found are these 4 examples that you could say are definitely hinting at or talking about those sorts of things. The first one is like, oh, it's plagued my mind. Yeah, it's like somebody's influencing the mind, is causing distress in doing so. I think that is an example of that. But when it says a violation of their autonomy, which you think would be the best example, the strongest example of that, it isn't being used in a way that my autonomy is being violated. I'm using the likeness of somebody else, and that's a violation of their autonomy. So it's if you like, it's going out from the text rather than coming into the narrator. Does that make sense? So is part of the theme. I still highlight it as being significant, but it isn't quite the same. And nor is this one, again, which you think that paragraph there is really on the money there. But it is also, oh, you know, I'm desecrating the memory of somebody. I'm desecrating the memory of their being. I'm reducing them to a mere tool. seems very Lovecraftian, but I'm doing it. It's not being done to me. So I think that it's picked up that as a theme, but because it's written in this way, that it's not really using it in a Lovecraftian way. I think that in that one we definitely say, passing grade, you have recognised a Lovecraftian theme and utilised it. So definitely we start to look at the adjectives, and I've started highlighting them here. You see quite a difference in that there's a lot less of them. This would be fairly typical, I think, in non-fiction writing as opposed to fiction. You would expect, I think, to see less of them. But there's also the fact that like AI art is used here, here, and here, and we've given it that. I mean, you could even argue that AI-generated art is a noun phrase and not necessarily an adjective of the sort that we're looking at. Just you can see that they're just generally not used in the same way. We don't have any example here of whether it be 2, 3, 4 adjectives used about a single noun. And on top of that, in the bottom here we've got good, and there's only 3 examples of good in the Call of Cthulhu, so you think there's probably not a word that we would expect to see used a lot. We would expect to see the words old, strange, ancient and terrible, those sorts of things. None of those are here, and we're seeing instead some very sparse and limited use of very average and sort of unevocative adjectives. In terms of like a Lovecraftian use of adjectives that we have here, like that, the incessant scratching, we might have that odd incessant scratching or something along those lines to sort of give that little bit of extra. It comes on to what we're going to talk about next, which is the doubling. So we've got the likenesses of people and artist styles. So what you see if you look for the doubling is it just not sort of present, and certainly not in the Lovecraftian way. Let's have a look at the first passage here, that the ethics of using AI-generated art in the likeness of people and artist styles. So you've got, okay, that's kind of an example of what we're talking about. It's a question that has long vexed me. But if we're talking about it in a Lovecraftian way, then we would say concerned and vexed me. A concern that has plagued my mind. Perhaps we wouldn't use concern then. Troubled then. We don't want to double up, so we're going to go with troubled and vexed me. A concern that has plagued my mind like the incessant scratching at the door of some eldritch abomination. But it wouldn't be just the incessant scratching, it would be incessant scratching and... So I've gone with scratching and snuffling at the door like some eldritch abomination. We're looking at just doubling, but also making it more interesting, making it more animalistic. It's not really been done here at all. What's interesting as well, when you get into the second passage, to use the likeness of a living person without their knowledge or consent. Why not and knowledge and consent? To exploit their image for our own gain is a transgression of the most heinous nature. It is a violation of their autonomy and a disdain for their privacy. It is to desecrate the very memory of their being and to reduce them to a mere tool for our own exploitation. So we're seeing all these examples where it could have used the doubling and hasn't. It's actually used or instead. So it's picking up sort of a more academic non-fiction style when it's been asked to write in HP Lovecraft style, and it really isn't. So now we're going to have a look for relative clauses and appositives. So again, I've gone through and highlighted a few examples. And I think that the examples that I found are kind of few and far between and not, again, done in that Lovecraftian style. In fact, there are opportunities here to have done it in a more Lovecraftian way that the AI hasn't taken. For example, this first one here, if we go to exploit their reputation and image for our own gain, we've gone with the doubling. We made that a little bit more Lovecraftian without the permission of the surviving kin or estate. See if we put a represented and mistaken in there, it makes it a little bit more, giving it that doubling, but is also sort of is maybe a little bit contrived, that one, because you really would in a non-fiction piece, you really would say represented or mistaken, I think. So it's a little bit contrived. But I still think that with 3 examples across, 4 or 5 paragraphs that I've checked there, that it's hard really to say if it's that distinguishing a feature of Lovecraft's work and that it's tried to pick it in, or whether it's just standard English is represented in that same sort of way. Again, it would have been nice to compare Lovecraft's work with a broader corpus. But I have to try and operate fairly quickly because the AI does this very rapidly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go away and I'm going to respond to the same prompt, which was, give me a few hundred words on the ethics of using the likeness of people both living and dead, as well as artist styles, in the prompting of AI-generated art. Please write in the style of HP Lovecraft. So I'm going to try and write in the style of HP Lovecraft. I'm going to try and respond to those two prompts, and then we're going to see who's the winner, me or the AI. Be back in a moment. Okay, so it's about an hour later. You could probably tell that it's changed if you can hear the wind and the rain outside now, which is really quite strong, but I don't know how well this microphone will pick it up. And I've responded to the prompt, come up with something, and I'm going to have a go at reading it, and it's on the screen as well. During the summer of 1927, while travelling the narrow alleys and twisted pathways of Arkham, New England, in service of some vague intellectual pursuit or another, an unexpected telegram sent me, driving a vehicle fueled and rented for the purpose, on a wild goose chase to distant Boston. Returning some hours later, frustrated and irritable, my growing stomach caused my attention to stray, followed by the vehicle. A brief foray into a drainage ditch followed, and though I and my motor car emerged without significant injury, being always of a nervous disposition, I resolved to stop and settle my agitation should I happen upon an opportunity to do so. One was not long in presenting itself, and although the ramshackle nature of the building promised little, it was the solitary structure I could note in any direction. The bays allocated for the parking of motorised carriages such as my rented vehicle stood empty, and I halted to peruse the strange establishment, twisted and odd as it was. The two windows either side of the front door were boarded, the ancient boards themselves showing all the signs of a long age of neglect and decay, while the door between them was ajar, a dark foreboding rectangle that promised less still than the decrepit structure had. Yet I had a vague compulsion to go inside. I stepped into a gloomy throwback to a different age, that long-forgotten concern once called an internet cafe. It was staffed by a tall and surly, racial slur deleted, who served me coffee without a word, and although I would have preferred tea, being of a more civilized breed, I was grateful for the drink and the silence. Yet even this far from society and civilization, and while I had seen no mode of transportation beyond my own vehicle outside, I was not alone, for two youths of a decidedly ragged and low disposition were huddled around one of the handful of devices, old and unclean, and often called an Apple Macintosh, the feeble, dreamlike blue light emanating from which served as the only illumination in the building, and it cast abominably disfigured shadows in the dark corners. The boys, for they could scarce have been teenagers, crowded the machine as if to obscure a malevolent purpose from the staff, yet inexplicably, despite the rattling of the cup in my hand, I was drawn to investigate the secretive and terrible gathering. What I saw stood me fixedly in place, paralysed by some force beyond my perception. As I gazed into the baleful, dreamlike luminosity, strange images appeared of hateful, twisted cruelties beyond the imaginings of mere men, images of times distant and terrible beyond our measuring, odd places beyond our reach. With wild abandon and stricken with terror, my cup tumbled to the floor and I shrieked aloud, for what kind of creature would turn on its own race to strike twisted bargains with those that wished us harm, enslavement? Upon that screen was scarce a thought for the sad, lifeless creatures whose visages they had snatched from ancient times, stolen, twisted into tortured, uncanny shapes, emptied of life and soul, were the images that would drive artists insane from the farthest reaches of the distant Indies to the mountains of civilization-spawning Greece. AI art. Okay, so in terms of vocabulary, I've highlighted the words that came up in our search of the Call of Cthulhu, and I've shown you where I've used them. Now, there are a couple of things that, with a little more time and an opportunity to proofread, that I wouldn't actually have done, but I actually don't think that Lovecraft himself would have been that concerned about. For example, I've got dreamlike here and here, that's quite close together. It's going to start to feel like a lack of vocabulary, and I don't think that most people would accuse Lovecraft of that. So I probably would have liked to have changed one of those. And here you can see I've got terrible and terrible far too close to each other. That really does feel like sort of weak repetition rather than use of those words for a good point. So a couple of little things that are a bit disappointing there, but like I said, I did it not in a hurry, but fairly quickly. But in terms of vocabulary, I feel like those words at least are matching Lovecraft. In terms of external compulsion, other energies affecting or influencing me, I've highlighted a couple of examples of that there just to show that I've included those as well. In terms of adjectives, I'm not going to go through them all. You can see some of the examples there. You can see that I have tried, but it's very alien to sort of repeat what Lovecraft did, where I have like 3, 4, 5 adjectives. You start to be looking for a way to put some before and some after, using an appositive perhaps. And I'll show you an example of that in a second, because it's not how we write. It's unusual to write in that way. We tend to go 1 adjective, fine, 2 adjectives, 3, 4, 5. You're starting to show yourself as, in modern times at least, as an unprofessional writer, is revealing of the amateur writer. Whereas I wouldn't actually accuse Lovecraft of being that. So here's a few examples of some of the doubling that I've done. It's not all of them by any means, but it's just quite a few. And you can see where I've used them sort of as an appositive here, like devices is your noun, old and unclean is more information about the noun. That's what we call an appositive when we do something like that. The establishment, twisted and odd. Not quite the same here, whereas like of a long age of neglect and decay, frustrated and irritable. So you can see a few examples of that, and we'll have a look, and I'll just show you a few examples of the subordinate clauses that I've used. You can always tell when you've got one because you can kind of take it out and the rest of the sentence will still make a degree of sense. It was not long in presenting itself, and it was a solitary structure I could note in any direction makes sense, but although the ramshackle nature of the building promised little, is that extra Lovecraftian detail that's been added in there. And here, yet even this far from society and civilization, I was not alone, makes sense on its own, but with that extra clause in the middle there, that Lovecraftian feel, that extra detail is always extra detail. And while I had seen no mode of transportation beyond my own vehicle outside, here we actually have a doubling of them, which I was particularly proud of, even though I do accept that it's a little contrived, and that being of a more civilized breed probably should be there, or even at the end there. Well, I was grateful for the drink and silence being of a more civilized breed, but if you put it there, it actually feels much more of like a racial slur towards the person that served the drink. So what I've done is I've included the vocabulary of Lovecraft. I've included hints of external compulsion, as Lovecraft does. I've included a lot of adjectives, as Lovecraft does. I've used ands and doubling wherever I could, probably too much. And I've embedded clauses and appositives just for that extra bit of detail, just like Lovecraft does. Always, always with the details. If you go through the whole thing, you'll find even more examples than fit on the screen at any one particular point. So what I would like to see, if you feel I have defeated the AI, and it took me a lot longer than it took the computer, I bet, then I want to see an F in the chat for our fallen AI overlord. And if you feel that the AI has crushed me and my efforts to replicate the style of HP Lovecraft, then by all means put RIP in the chat. Either way, I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Thank you for watching, and if you want to buy one of my books, search for Professor Lovecraft by Brent Seagull on Amazon and eBay.